Two people make the same money, start with the same $50,000, and make one different decision. One buys a rental property. The other invests in the stock market. They both think they made the smarter move. They're both wrong. Not because one loses money and the other wins, but because neither of them actually stopped to calculate what this decision would cost them over the next 20 years. One of them is counting income that hasn't survived real expenses yet, and the other is underestimating how slow real wealth feels when it's quietly compounding in the background. And when I sat down and ran the full numbers, not the version people post online, not the version that sounds good at dinner, but the version that includes everything, the result wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a clear winner. It was two completely different lives, built on two completely different systems, somehow landing in almost the same place, but with very different levels of stress, time commitment, and control along the way. And that's the part no one talks about. Welcome to Dom Finance, I am Dom. If you're trying to build real financial freedom without getting pulled into decisions that only look smart on the surface, subscribe and stay with me, because this is where the math starts to tell a very different story. And to understand why the outcome ends up so close, you have to look at where they both actually started, not where the story makes it feel like they started. So let's strip this down and keep it honest, because most comparisons skip this part. Both of them are working with the same reality, not some ideal version of it. Same age, same income, around $55,000 a year, and the same $50,000 saved after years of doing things right, cutting back when they had to, and finally getting to a point where they feel like this is their shot to do something smart. One of them, let's call him Daniel, looks at that money and wants control. He wants something tangible, something that feels real, so he uses it as a down payment on a $250,000 rental property. He takes on a 30-year mortgage at around 7%, locking himself into a monthly payment a little over $1,300. Then he finds a tenant willing to pay $1,800 a month, and on paper, it looks clean. There's a gap there, a few $100s every month, and it feels like he just created income out of thin air. The other one, let's call him Eric, goes the opposite direction, and honestly, it doesn't look impressive at all. He takes the same $50,000 and puts it into a total market index fund, no leverage, no complexity, nothing he can physically point to. Then he sets up an automatic $300 contribution each month and lets it run quietly in the background of his life. And if I'm being real with you, standing at that exact moment, before anything plays out, Daniel's path feels like progress, while Eric's just feels like waiting, and that difference in feeling is where most people make the decision without realizing what they're not seeing yet. And this is where things start to feel very different, because the first few years don't reward the best strategy, they reward the one that feels the most real. In the beginning, Daniel feels like he made a smart move, and it's not hard to see why. Every month, money shows up in his account, and it's tied to something he can actually see. There's a property, there's a tenant, there's a sense that something is happening. He drives by the house and feels ownership, not just financially, but psychologically. It feels like progress, like he's building something tangible while everyone else is just thinking about it. Eric's experience couldn't be more different. He checks his account once in a while, sees the number move a little, then stall, then move again. 50,000 turns into 55, then maybe 60. There's no story behind it, no moment where it feels like a win, and definitely nothing that makes him feel ahead. If anything, it feels slow, almost disappointingly slow, like he's doing the responsible thing but missing out on something bigger. And if the story stopped right there, most people would pick Daniel without hesitation, because the difference in how it feels is that obvious. But this is exactly where I had to force myself to slow down and look past the surface, because that clean gap between what Daniel pays and what he collects doesn't stay clean for long. Property taxes start taking their cut, insurance quietly chips away at the margin, and then reality shows up in the form of things breaking at the worst possible time. A water heater goes out, a small leak turns into a bigger repair, or a tenant moves out and suddenly there's a stretch with no income at all, just expenses stacking in the background. Once you actually account for all of that, the number that looked so predictable starts to feel a lot less stable. Over the first few years, Daniel isn't building the kind of profit that shows up in conversations, he's building something much slower, and much more dependent on things going right. And what caught me off guard wasn't that the number got smaller, it was how easy it would have been to never notice if I had just accepted the original math at face value. And once you start pulling on that thread, you realize the number that looked smaller wasn't the problem, it was the number you never bothered to question in the first place. Because this is where most people get trapped, not by bad investments, but by incomplete math that feels good enough to stop thinking. Daniel's situation doesn't fall apart, it just slowly reveals what was always there, hidden behind a clean monthly number that never told the full story. Vacancy is the first thing that forces you to pay attention, because even in a solid area, a property sitting empty for a month each year is normal, not worst case. That's one full mortgage payment with no income to offset it, and it doesn't feel theoretical when it happens, it feels like pressure. Then there's maintenance, which sounds manageable until you realize it's not optional. A small repair here and there doesn't change much, but over time it adds up, and every property has a rhythm of things breaking, wearing down, or simply aging out. Some years it's minor, other years it's a large expense that shows up all at once and demands to be handled immediately. You don't get to delay it, because someone is living there, and that responsibility sits with you whether you plan for it or not. What really shifted my perspective was understanding that these aren't rare events, they are built into the system. The roof will need to be replaced, the heating system will eventually fail, and every one of those costs arrives in chunks, not smooth monthly payments. If you're not setting money aside consistently, you're not running a strategy, you're hoping nothing goes wrong at the wrong time. And then there's the decision most people avoid thinking about, which is whether to manage everything yourself or pay someone else to do it. If you hire help, a percentage of your rent disappears immediately, reducing your already thin margin. If you don't, you're the one answering messages, coordinating repairs, and carrying the mental load of something that never fully turns off. Either way, there is a cost, it just shows up in a different form. The part that stuck with me is how none of this is hidden, it's just rarely included when people talk about returns. Everyone focuses on what comes in, almost no one focuses on what actually stays. And once you start looking at it that way, you begin to see how easy it is to build a financial plan on numbers that were never complete to begin with. And once you accept that those hidden costs are part of the deal, the story stops being about surprises and starts becoming about what each path actually demands from you over time. By the time Daniel reaches year 5, he's no longer operating on assumptions, he's operating on experience. He's been through tenant turnover, dealt with repairs that couldn't wait, and handled situations that didn't show up in any spreadsheet when he first ran the numbers. The property is still there, still producing income, but now it feels less like a simple investment and more like something that requires ongoing attention. Rent has increased, which helps, but so have expenses, and when everything is accounted for, the return he's actually keeping lands somewhere in that 3 to 5% range on the cash he's put in. It's steady, but it's not extraordinary, and it comes with responsibility that never fully disappears. At the same time, Eric's situation still looks uneventful from the outside, but underneath, something important has started to shift. His portfolio has grown into the range where the gains are no longer just coming from what he puts in each month. The growth itself is beginning to generate more growth, and that change is subtle at first, but it builds momentum. What once felt slow now starts to feel like it's moving on its own, even though he hasn't changed anything about his approach. What caught me off guard here is that there isn't a dramatic turning point, no single moment where one path suddenly pulls ahead. Instead, the difference shows up in how each system behaves over time. Daniel's progress is tied to effort, decisions, and how well he manages things as they come up. Eric's progress is tied to consistency and time, and the longer he stays in, the less effort it seems to require. And this is where the comparison becomes less about which one is better, and more about what kind of life each path quietly builds in the background while you're focused on the numbers in front of you. And when you stretch both paths far enough, past the noise, past the emotions, and into a full 20-year timeline, that's when the story finally becomes clear. By year 20, Daniel is sitting on a property that has likely appreciated significantly, somewhere in the range of $450,000 to $500,000 depending on the market. His mortgage is either fully paid off or close enough that it no longer feels like a burden. On paper, it looks like a win, and in many ways, it is. He owns a real asset, something solid, something that has survived 2 decades of ups and downs. But getting there wasn't just about holding on. Over those 20 years, he dealt with cycles of tenants coming and going, periods where the property needed major work, and ongoing costs that never really stopped. When you step back and add everything together, the additional profit he actually kept from cash flow, beyond all expenses, lands somewhere in a modest range. It's real, but it's not life-changing by itself, and it came with a steady level of responsibility the entire time. Eric's outcome looks different, but in a way that surprised me even more. With consistent contributions and an average return that doesn't require perfection, his portfolio ends up in a very similar range, roughly $420,000 to $460,000. There's no physical asset to point to, no single moment where it feels like everything paid off, just a number that grew quietly over time until it became something substantial. What made me pause wasn't who came out ahead, because depending on the exact conditions, either one could. It was how close they ended up after taking completely different routes. One path required active involvement, decision-making, and tolerance for things going wrong. The other required patience, discipline, and the ability to stay calm when the market didn't cooperate. And that's when the comparison stopped being about returns for me, and started being about the price each person paid along the way, not just in money, but in time, energy, and how much control they actually had over their day-to-day life. And once you see that both paths can land in a similar place, the next question almost asks itself, what happens if you make a small adjustment instead of a completely different decision? Because this is the part that quietly changes the math in a way most people underestimate. Eric doesn't need to overhaul his strategy, he doesn't need to chase higher returns or take on more risk. If he simply increases his monthly contribution from $300 to $500, nothing dramatic in the moment, just a slightly tighter budget and a bit more consistency, the long-term outcome shifts in a way that feels almost disproportionate. Over 20 years, that small increase doesn't just add a little extra, it compounds into something significantly larger, pushing his portfolio well beyond what it would have been otherwise. And what stood out to me wasn't just the bigger number, it was how little had to change in his behavior to create that difference. No new system, no added complexity, just a slightly stronger commitment repeated over time. When I compare that to Daniel's path, the contrast becomes clearer. If he wants to meaningfully increase his results, it usually requires expanding, buying another property, taking on another loan, and adding another layer of responsibility. Growth in that system tends to come with more moving parts, not just more consistency. And that's when something clicked for me. One path scales through discipline, the other scales through expansion. One asks you to stay the same for a long time, the other asks you to take on more as you go. Neither is wrong, but they demand very different versions of you over time, and that difference matters more than most people realize when they're focused only on the outcome. And once you understand how both paths scale, you start to realize the real mistake most people make happens long before they ever see the results. Because this was never really about choosing between real estate or the stock market in the first place. That's just the surface-level debate that keeps people distracted. The deeper issue is how decisions are made when the full picture isn't visible, and how easy it is to feel confident based on incomplete information. Most people don't sit down and map out 20 years. They don't factor in time, stress, uncertainty, or how their own behavior might change under pressure. Instead, they rely on whatever feels convincing in the moment, a conversation with a friend, a video that highlights the upside, or a simple number that sounds good enough to trust. I used to think the goal was to pick the better investment, but the more I looked into it, the more obvious it became that the real risk is never running the full equation. When you skip that step, it doesn't matter what you choose, because you're building your strategy on a version of reality that was simplified just enough to feel comfortable. And that's how people stay stuck, not because they chose wrong, but because they never actually understood what they were choosing. And once you see how easy it is to build an entire strategy on incomplete thinking, the only thing that really matters is asking a better question before you commit years of your life to it. Because at the end of the day, this was never about Daniel or Eric, and it was never about real estate or the stock market. It was about the gap between what something promises and what it actually delivers once you include everything that comes with it. The time you don't get back, the stress you didn't plan for, the discipline you didn't realize it would take, all of it quietly shaping your outcome long before the numbers ever catch up. So before you make your next financial move, whether it's buying a property, investing in the market, or just trying to figure out your next step, slow down long enough to ask yourself one simple question. Did I include everything? Not just the upside, not just the version that sounds good, but the full reality of what this decision will demand from me over time. Because when you step back and look at the full picture, the lesson here becomes clear. Different paths can lead to similar outcomes, but they rarely cost the same to walk. And the real goal isn't to chase what looks the most impressive today, it's to build a system you can actually live with for the next 20 years without burning out or losing control. If this made you think differently about how you approach money, subscribe to the channel and stay with me, because we're going to keep breaking down these decisions in a way that actually helps you build something real, not just something that looks good on the surface.